began as a whisper, a faint chill that seeped into the log walls before the first snowflake ever fell. You could feel it in the stillness of the late autumn air. I held breath waiting to be released. The world seemed to pause on the edge of something vast and indifferent. This was not the winter of carols and cheerful hearths, of swift passing storms and bright recoveries. This was winter as a permanent state, a white siege laid against the soul. Imagine the silence first, not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, woolen quiet that smothered the landscape. It fell with the snow and stayed, burying the familiar contours of the land, the path to the spring, the split minus rail fence. Inside the cabin, the silence took on a different texture, woven with the soft crackle of resin in the fire and the shallow breathing of its inhabitants. Time, that steady river, slowed to a trickle, then froze solid. Dawn was a reluctant graying at the single window, a pale smudge that offered no promise. To noon was a brief, bleak light that did little more than cast long blue shadows from the pines. Dusk arrived swiftly, a curtain drawn by an unseen hand, plunging the small room back into a world defined by firelight. In this realm, the clock and the calendar lost all meaning. Tuesday, what did the month matter? Markings on a beam became a futile gesture, a scratch against infinity. You measured time in the consumption of things. In the shrinking of the woodpile, a fortress of logs becoming a dwindling citadel. In the settling level of cornmeal in the barrel, a slow, granular tide going out. In the thick candle stump, its glow growing more precious with each millimeter lost of flame. This was the arithmetic of survival, a grim calculation repeated daily in the mind. The fire was the pulsing heart of it all, a living thing that demanded constant devotion. He learned its moods, the way it whispered when content, roared when hungry, sighed as it settled into embers. Banking it for the night was a ritual of faith and fear. To let it die was to invite a cold so profound it felt alive, a creature that would climb into your bones and nest there. Sleep was thin and fractured, punctuated by the necessary, shivering pilgrimage to feed the flames. He would wake, not from dreams, but from the cold's insistent pressure, and shuffle to the hearth on numb feet. The world outside the door was a sculpture of ice, beautiful and dead. Stepping out was to enter a gallery of stillness. Snow lay in deep, unbroken drifts, ending the boughs of fir trees into white arches. The air was sharp enough to cut the lungs, and the silence was so absolute it rang in your ears. You did not linger. The beauty was a trap, a siren song of emptiness. The real world, the only world that mattered, was the 6-foot circle of warmth around the hearth. Inside, life condensed to its most essential rhythms. Movement was slow, conserving warmth and energy. Conversation dwindled to the practical, to the pointing out of a draft that needed stuffing with rags, to the question of whether the last of the salt pork should be used today or tomorrow. Breaks were calories burned, and calories were finite. Even family, bound by blood and shared plight, could retreat into separate silences, islands in the small sea of the room. Marriage could be tested not by strife, but by this relentless, intimate stillness. You came to know every nuance of your partner's face in the flickering light, every habitual sigh, the way they held their hands to the heat. There was no privacy, no mystery, only the exhaustive familiarity of a shared trial. Monotony was the true enemy, a gray fatigue of the spirit. The same view, the same tasks, the same taste on the tongue day after endless day. You would stare at the frost ferns on the window, their intricate, fragile patterns a mockery of the frozen world outside. You would watch the flames until you saw shapes and stories in them, until your eyes ached. The mind, deprived of novelty, would turn inward, digging through memories like an old trunk. You remembered the smell of sun on summer grass, the unbearable lightness of a shirt without layers, the taste of a fresh picked berry, its sweetness a forgotten language. These memories were not comforts, they were exquisite tortures, proof of a paradise lost. Hope itself became a dangerous luxury. To hope for an early thaw was to set yourself up for a crushing disappointment each morning when the cold held firm, harder to cultivate a grim patience, to narrow your vision to the immediate. The goal was not to see spring, but to see tonight, to ensure the fire lasted until dawn. This was existence bared down to its stubborn core, the will to persist, breath by breath, through a season that felt eternal. Then, one day without fanfare, a change would whisper at the edges of perception. It was not a warming, not yet, but a softening of the cold's edge. The wind would lose its serrated bite, shifting to a weary sigh. The snow on the roof would begin to drip in the afternoon sun. The plink, plink, plinked a strange and sudden music. One morning, you would hear it the clear, bell minus like call of a chickadee from a snow minus laden pine. The sound was a shock, an intrusion of life into the kingdom of stillness. It was the first note of a song you had forgotten, and it meant everything. The thaw, and it truly came, was a messy, reluctant affair. It revealed not the earth, but a landscape of mud and rotting ice, the things long buried. It was ugly and difficult, but it was change, it was motion. The world was returning, not with a flourish, but with a slow, muddy crawl back to life. And you, emerging from your cabin, blinking in the strengthening light, were different. You had passed through something. You had learned the weight of time in the depth of silence. You had made an intimate acquaintance with your own endurance. Experience left no visible scar, but it etched something on the soul knowledge of how thin the margin could be, and how vast the patience required to survive within it. This was the quiet, aching heart of the frontier winter. It was not an adventure, it was an endurance. It was the long wait in the antechamber of the world, listening for the sound of spring's distant key in the lock. Let us give this experience a name, a face, a set of hands that held a quill. Her name was Sarah, a widow of practical means from Boston, a woman who kept accounts and ran a small school. In the far 1704, this called herself to New Haven. The journey out was an anthology of colonial discomfort, filthy inns, wretched food, roads that were little more than suggestions in the wilderness. He noted it all in a journal with a dry, witty pen, observing her world with the clear eyes of a woman who relied on her own wits. The journey back was to be a reverse of the first, a reckoning with the same poor accommodations. That autumn on the coast is a fickle creature, and winter, waiting in the wings, decided to make an early entrance. The snow began softly, a few stray flakes that seemed harmless. Within a day, it was a relentless white curtain. The roads, miserable when dry, became treacherous gulfs of mire and deepening snow. Progress slowed for miles per day, 2 yards per hour. Pod guides grew quiet, their eyes perpetually scanning the iron-gray sky. She was a city woman, but intelligent enough to read the alarm in their silence. The calculation had failed. Winter had won the race. She found herself stranded in a place called Dedham, at a frontier homestead that was little more than a cabin, a barn, and a stubborn claim staked against the wilderness. The family who took her and did so without ceremony. They were a unit of few words, a man, a woman, 3 children, their faces already shaped by hardship. Her coins were accepted, but they were meaningless here. The real currency was food, heat, and the patience to outlast the cold. Her journal entries, once rich with detail and commentary, began to shrink. December something. One might begin. The date already lost. Snow continues. Cold. Ain't mush. The prose flattened into a record of bare sustenance. The vibrant observer from Boston was being subdued, forced into the same narrow existence as her hosts. The cabin was a single dark room, the air thick with wood smoke and the smell of damp wool. The window, covered with oiled paper, glowed like a sickly eye. Frost painted the inside walls in delicate, malignant patterns. Our world contracted to the heart sign. The stool she sat on, the pallet of straw where she slept. She was a woman of letters, of business, of city bustle. Here, her skills were useless. She offered to teach the children, but the mother politely declined. Learning was for a world with a future. Here, they lived only in the urgent, endless present. The days dissolved into one another. She would wake to the same tile, tend to the same fire, eat the same course meal. The family moved around her like ghosts in a shared tomb, performing their silent choice. Conversation was as scarce as sugar. They took to praying, not from deep piety, but for the comfort of structured speech, the familiar rhythm of psalms and the suffocating quiet. The greatest struggle was not physical, but mental. It was the battle against a creeping existential dread, the question that whispered in the long afternoons, what if this is all there is? What if the spring does not come? Her mind, once so active, began to feel woolly, slow, adrift on a gray sea of sameness. They missed her home, her students, her own bed with a sharpness that was physical, but to dwell on it was to pour salt on a wound. She learned it, as the settlers knew instinctively, to lower her gaze from the horizon of hope to the immediate ground of survival. Just get through today. Just keep the fire alive. Just breathe. Yes, bled into which she guessed was January. The cold deepened, finding its way through every chink, settling in her joints. He noticed the mother's hands, red and raw, counting beans with a new frugality. The portions grew smaller. The man spent longer outside, returning empty minas handed from check traps. His shoulders slumped in a silent language of failure. He felt like a burden, a drain on their precarious reserves, yet there was nowhere else to go. The wilderness, in its white silence, was a perfect prison. And a morning arrived that felt different. The light at the window was not grayer, but held a faint, yellow warmth. The drip from the roof began, a steady percussion against the stone step. No one remarked on it, but she felt a shift in the cabin's mood, a subtle loosening of the tension that had held them all winter. A few days later, a bird song a clear, defiant trill that shattered the silence like glass. It was the first note of the world's return. When the man finally said the roads might be passable, there was no celebration, only a grim nod. She gathered her few things, paid the family with the last of her coins, and mounted her weary horse. The journey back to Boston was a battle against mud and exhaustion, but it was movement. It was purpose regained. Boston, when she reached it, assaulted her senses. The noise, the smell, the press of people, it was overwhelming. She retreated to her room for a full day, acclimating to the shock of civilization. She had survived, but she carried the winter within her. In later years, when asked about her journey, she would share the amusing tales of bad inns and eccentric hosts. The long, silent weeks in Dedham she glossed over. There was no drama there to entertain a drawing room, only the profound, boring truth of waiting. Her published journal became a historical footnote, studied for its details of early travel. The real story, the unheroic epic of her endurance, is read in the gaps between her words, in the entries that say nothing because there was nothing left to say. She lived many years after, successful and capable, but she never again ventured far in winter. He had learned the difference between choosing a challenge and being chosen by one, between a hardship with an end and one that feels like eternity itself. Her winter was an accident, a parenthesis in her life. For the family in the cabin, it was simply life. They would face another winter and another. The reliance not a choice but a condition of existence. Sarah's story is a single thread, and it leads us to the larger tapestry, the culture woven in those dark, cold rooms. If we examine the physical remains, the cabin foundations, the high stones, they tell a story of brutal practicalities. These structures were machines for retaining heat. Those ceilings trapped warmth. Tiny windows minimized its escape. The door was often the weakest point, leading to the invention of the airlock entry, a small vestibule to buffer the cold. Everything was oriented not for view, but for shelter from the prevailing wind, tucked against hillsides or within stands of trees. The hearth was the altar, and the fire the fragile god. Life organized itself in concentric circles around it. The archaeology speaks of a perpetual, grinding maintenance, chinting and drapes, Inting the gaps between logs, the endless hauling and splitting of wood, the careful storage of food in pits below the frost line. This was a life lived on the defensive, a long campaign against the cold. Inside these dim spaces, a unique relationship with time developed. Without the sun's reliable arc, without the markers of community life, time became subjective elastic. Some families clung to ritual, marking Sundays with a special prayer or a slightly larger portion. Others surrendered to the flow, letting the days merge into a seamless, gray continuum. You measured time in the visceral, the growl of hunger between meals, the consumption of a log, the ache in your bones that meant another drop in temperature. The concept of wasting time became meaningless. What was there to waste? Surviving was the occupation. This temporal distortion had psychological effect. A mind, starved of novelty, could turn in on itself. Dark thoughts, doubts about the decision to come to this hard place, fears for the future, these found fertile ground in the idle hours. People learned techniques to manage this, perhaps without even naming them. The repetitive motion of whittling, mending, knitting, the hypnotic focus on the flames, your recitation of every story, every psalm, every bit of gossip until they were worn smooth as river stones. Silence was not empty, it was a medium you learned to navigate, to read the subtle sounds of a settling cabin, the different qualities of wind. It taught a brutal mindfulness. You were present in your discomfort, because there was absolutely nowhere else to be. The social dynamics within these pressurized spaces are fascinating to consider. Proximity without privacy is a potent formula for tension. Yet, accounts suggest not constant strife, but often a deepening of unspoken bonds. A set glance could convey what words could not. People developed a keen sensitivity to each other's moods, knowing when to offer the last bit of something sweet, when to take on a chore without being asked, when to simply grant a gift of silence. Humor, when it surfaced, was dark and dry, a pressure valve for shared frustration. Children adapted, the natural boisterousness dampened into a watchful quiet. They played games with pebbles and string, or lost themselves in vast, intricate daydreams. They were learning the frontier's first and greatest lesson: how to be still. Food was fuel, but also a psychological anchor. The monotony of the diet: cornmeal, salt pork, beans was a constant background hum of deprivation. Yet, the rituals around food held power. The preparation of a meal, however simple, was a purposeful act. The shared consumption, even in fact, was a reaffirmation of the group. And, in the long evenings, people would talk about food remembered and food imagined: the feast of spring grains, the taste of a fresh egg. These conversations were acts of collective hope, blueprints for a future they had to believe would come. The line between endurance and breaking was perilously thin. History records the successes, the families who persevered. It is largely silent on those who broke, the ones who succumbed to a melancholy, who gave up, who did not rise one morning. Their stories are the negative space in the narrative, a reminder of the cost. The culture that emerged was one of profound patience, a stamina of the spirit. It was not about conquering nature, but about aligning with its terrible, slow rhythm. It was about finding a way to be, not to do. This patient, watchful, inwardly resilient way of life stood in stark contrast to the experience of winter in the established towns and cities of the coast. Fier, winter was a season of moderated inconvenience. In the brick homes of Philadelphia or Boston, multiple fireplaces blazed. Owland would arrived by the cartload, purchased with currency. Glass windows held back the cold while admitting light. Candles and oil lamps pushed back the night, allowing reading, writing, and conversation. The wealthy dined on varied fare brought by trade: spices, sugars, preserved fruits. Their social calendars thinned, but did not vanish. Visits, dinners, and church services continued. Winter for them was a backdrop, not a cage. Fold might knit but a gentleman on his way to the counting minus house. But inside, his work continued in warmth. The merchant's wife might lament the difficulty of keeping her hands warm while doing needlework by the fire. Their complaints were real, but they existed on a different plane of experience altogether. The frontier settlers' winter was a fight for survival. The urban elite's winter was a negotiation with discomfort. This disparity was a brutal lens on power. Warmth was not a right, but a commodity. Light was not a given, but a purchase. Security was not a season, but a financial state. Hey. Winter exposed the architecture of class with unforgiving clarity. The snow fell on both mansion and cabin, but its meaning was entirely different. For one, it was a scenery; for the other, a sentence. Its divide was self-minus perpetuating. The merchant, warm in his office, could consolidate his accounts and plans through the winter. The settler, merely surviving, fell further behind. When spring finally unlocked the roads, the settler emerged desperate to sell, often at the merchant's prices, to repay debts accrued for survival. Winter had quietly enriched the already comfortable and impoverished the already struggling. It was a slow, silent engine of inequality. People like Sarah, who moved between these worlds, felt the jarring contrast. A missionary or trader might experience the profound isolation of the frontier winter and then, within days, be back in a warm tavern, the experience already receding into a strange true. This cognitive dissonance was rarely examined. Prosperity was seen as providence, hardship as a test or a personal failing. The system itself, which allocated warmth and security so unevenly, was seldom questioned. It was simply the way of the world, made undeniably visible when the cold set in. So, what are we to make of these long, dark winters of the past? They were not romantic. They were not character-building adventures in the simplistic sense. They were a profound encounter with limitation, with the indifferent power of the natural world, and with the raw mechanics of human endurance. They forged a particular kind of resilience, one born not of triumph, but of sheer, stubborn continuation. The people who lived through them learned a patience that is almost alien to our accelerated world. They learned to measure progress not in leaps, but in millimeters, in the gradual retreat of frost from a windowsill. They learned that sometimes the most courageous act is not to fight, but to wait, to tend the small flame and believe, against all immediate evidence, that the dawn will eventually come. Their story is a whisper from the edge of human experience. It reminds us of the thin veneer of our comfort, of how much we rely on systems to buffer us from the elemental. It suggests that there are forms of strength that leave no monument, only the quiet fact of persistence. And it offers a humbling perspective of our own winters of the spirit, our own seasons of waiting and uncertainty. Connect us to this long lineage of those who simply endured, breath by breath, until the world turned again. We sit now in our climate-controlled spaces, the outside cold held at bay by invisible systems. The dark is banished with a flick. Their waiting is for different downloads, deliveries, resolutions of personal traumas. Yet, in our own moments of stillness, when anxiety about the future presses close, they might touch a fragment of their understanding. We might learn from their hard-1 wisdom that not all progress is visible, that endurance has its own dignity, and that spring, in its own time, always finds a way. The last ember of their long-ago fire has cooled to ash. Their silence is complete, but the echo of their patience remains, alas etched not in stone, but in the very memory of cold, and in the profound, enduring value of waiting through the longest night. Fire crackled, its voice the only conversation in the long night, its poke and pops and hisses, the language of consumption and light. Outside, the world had been erased, replaced by a uniform, aching white. Inside, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of this single room, its boundaries marked by the retreating warmth of the hearth. Time did not pass, he read, accumulated, like the soot on the ceiling beams, layer upon indistinguishable layer. Morning was not an event, but a slight lessening of the darkness at the window, a pale smear on the oiled paper. He woke not to bird song, but to the deep, marrow-level knowledge of cold. They had crept under the blankets, into the spaces between your joints, a patient and persistent guest. The act of rising was a series of small surrenders. First, the warm pocket of air around your body, and the rough wool of the blankets, finally the contact of your soles with the frigid plank floor. Each movement was a calculation against energy spent and warmth lost. You became an economist of heat, hoarding it, spending it only on the most essential transactions. The hearth was your bank, and the woodpile your dwindling fortune. The fire, when coaxed back to life from the sleeping coals, was a kind of miracle you performed daily. Small flames, hesitant at first, and gaining confidence, licking at the dry kindling. They fed it carefully, a priest tending an altar. Its warmth was not a blanket, but a sphere, a fragile bubble pushing against the pressing cold. You could stand with your back to it and feet on your scar on your breast to fog the air before your face. 6 feet away, winter still ruled. This was the geography of your world, the warm country by the fire, and the cold colonies in the shadows. Your day was a map drawn in chores, each one a tiny rebellion against entropy. You checked the supplies, not because they had changed, but because the looking was a ritual, a confirmation that you were still in charge. The cornmeal in the barrel had settled slightly lower. The salt pork hanging from the rafter was a darker, harder thing than it had been in November. You ran a mental ledger, subtracting today's needs from the total, carrying the frightening remainder forward in your mind. The numbers weren't ever comforting. They spoke the language of if and maybe, if the cold breaks in February, if the traps yield something next week. Maybe there will be a thaw. The window, that fragile eye on the outside, required constant tending. She scraped the frost from the inside with a thumbnail, carving a portal to a world that offered no solace. The view was a study in monochrome white ground, gray sky, black trees sagging under their burdens. Sometimes, if the sun appeared, the glare off the snow was a physical pain, a sharp, brilliant lie that promised warmth but delivered none. You turned away from it, back to the true center, the fire. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was not mere absence of noise, but a thick, woolly presence. It absorbed the small sounds, the rustle of a skirt, the click of a spoon against a bowl, the sigh of someone shifting on a stool. In that silence, thoughts grew loud. You remembered foolish things, the weight of a summer apple in your hand, the feel of sweat trickling down your spine, the color of leaves in October. These memories were not nostalgia, they were artifacts from a lost civilization, proof that the world had once been soft and generous. They made the present seem like a mistake, a rotten turn taken in some forgotten void. Conversation with others, if there were others, became minimalist, stripped to the bone. Woods low, themes need soaking, winds from the north. Language shed its finery and stood shivering in its practical underwear. To speak of hopes or fears was to waste precious warmth on clouds. Even looks could become too heavy, too full of unspoken questions. So you learned to look at the fire instead, to read your future in the collapsing architecture of a burning log. Children, if there were children, learned the hardest lesson of all stillness, and natural fire was banked. Their laughter rationed. They sat with wide, watchful eyes, absorbing the adult's tense quiet, learning that the world could become the small, this hard, the silent. They played games with buttons and bits of string, their imaginations building vast, silent empires in the dust by the hearth. Afternoon was a long gray yawn. It was nothing to do that hadn't been done. Mending was finished. Tools were sharpened. Stories had been told until the words were smooth and meaningless. You sat, and you waited. Your mind, that restless creature, would pace the confines of your skull, looking for an exit and finding none. It would turn on itself, chewing over old regrets, future fears. To stop this, you developed tricks. You would count the knots in the wood of the opposite wall. You would try to recall every step of the path to the spring, naming each rock and root. You would listen to the different voices of the wind, the moan around the corner, the shriek through the chin-keen, the whisper under the door. This was how you stayed sane, by fragmenting eternity into manageable, meaningless observations. Hunger was a constant, low-minus-grade companion, not the sharp pang of starvation, had a dull, hollow presence, a reminder that your body was a furnace slowly consuming its own fuel. Meals were events not of pleasure, but of maintenance. You ate the cornmeal mush, the boiled beans, the tough strips of dried meat, and you felt the energy seep into your limbs, a temporary loan against the cold. You did not taste you refueled. As the light died, so too did the last pretense of daytime. Evening was the true dominion of winter. Fire became the sun, the moon, the stars. Its light danced on the walls, making the familiar strange. Shadows leapt and cowered. The corners of the cabin retreated into a darkness that felt solid, threatening. It might light a candle, a tiny brave defiance, but its glow only deepened the pools of black around it. The preparation for night was a solemn ritual. Food was brought in, enough within arm's reach to feed the fire until morning. The bed, a pile of blankets and hides, was arranged just so, close enough to the hearth to catch its radiating warmth. You banked the fire with care, building a nest of ashes around the core of coals, willing them to smolder through the long, dark hours. Then you lay down fully clothed and listened. The cabin spoke at night. The logs settled with groans that sounded like footsteps. The wind flexed its mufflers against the roof. A scrack somewhere in the forest with a report like a distant gunshot. Every sound was amplified by the silence, filtered through the sieve of your anxiety. Sleep was not a retreat, but a shallow, vigilant state. You surfaced from it often, dragged back to consciousness by the cold, or by some subconscious monitor checking the fire's status. It would rise, a phantom in your own home, an analog, watching the sparks whirl up the chimney like escaping dreams. Then back to the thin warmth of the bed to wait for the next cycle. This was the rhythm not of life, but of endurance. A slow, patient way of attrition fight against the cold. You did not live through these days, you weathered them. Like a stone weathers a river. Your personality, your hopes, your past, all of it was submerged beneath the single, overwhelming need to persist. You became a creature of routine, of conservation, of silence. The concept of future grew blurry. Spring was a fairy tale, a rumor from another world. The only future that felt real was the next hour, the next log, the next meal. This narrowing of vision was a survival mechanism. To think too far ahead was to confront the abyss of what is. What if the wood runs out? What if the food is gone before the thaw? What if this is the winter that never ends? Better not to ask. Better to focus on the immediate, the tangible, the grain of the wood in your hand, the weight of the pot, the exact color of the coals. Weeks lost their names. You might realize with a start that a holiday had passed, a birthday, some marker of civilized time. It didn't matter. Here, time was measured in the depth of a snowdrift outside the door, in the increasing translucence of the salt port, and the fatigue that settled deeper into your bones with each passing twilight. You were waiting, but not for anything specific. You were waiting for the world to change its mind, for the great, white machine of winter to wing down, for some signal, however faint, that you were not forgotten. That signal, when it came, was almost imperceptible. It was not a sudden warmth. It was a different quality of cold, less aggressive, less personal. It was the sound of dripping, a steady clink, drink from the roof cinch that you heard one afternoon. It was the way the snow, when you stepped on it, had a brittle crust instead of a soft crunch. Was a single bird, a flash of movement, of the trill of song so shocking it felt like a hallucination. These signs did not bring immediate relief. The mud they heralded was worse than snow in many ways. That they brought something more vital, the return of time. Future reasserted itself. You could think in terms of when again, when the mud dries, when the path is clear, when I can go to the settlement. The waiting was not over, but it had acquired a direction, an end point. The siege, you realized with a dull thud of relief, was lifting. The long hold was ending, not with a bang, but with a slow, wet sigh. And you, emerging from your cave of firelight, squinting in the gray, watery sun, were not the same person who had entered it. You were inner quieter, marked by an intimacy with stillness that would never fully leave you. You had learned the weight of silence in the depth of cold. You had net patience, not as a virtue, but as a stark, necessary fact of existence. The experience left no visible scar, but it changed the shape of your soul, teaching you the profound, unheroic courage of simply outlasting the dart. The world had shrunk to the size of a thought, and the thought was of cold. It was a presence more felt than seen, a patient thief stealing into the cabin through cracks no wider than a hair. It lay in wait on the floorboards, seeped from the walls, cold in the corners where the firelight failed. You learned its language, the subtle tightening of the skin on your face, the ache deep in the knuckles, the way your breath hung in the air like a ghost of itself before vanishing. Morning was not a beginning, but a resumption. You awoke into the same day you had left, as if sleep were merely a blink, a brief closing of the eyes against the relentless white. The dark yielded to a gray, directionless light that did nothing to warm, only to reveal the same for walls, the same frosted window, the same dwindling pile of fuel. Rising was a defeat. You abandoned the fragile sanctuary of your blankets. Each layer shed a step deeper into the chill. The floor was a shock, a reminder that the earth itself was frozen solid a few feet below. He moved to the hearth with the stiff, careful gait of someone walking on glass. The fire, reduced to a bed of sullen orange embers, was the last coal of a dying world. He fed it with the reverence of a supplicant, weighing untangling as light as bird bones, blowing gently until a flame, weakened blue, trembled into life. This small victory, the creation of heat, was the day's first and most important labor. The warm, thick cave was not a comfort, but a postponement that pushed the cold back a few feet, created a small circle of bearability. Zhu lived within that circle, orbiting the hearth like a captive planet. Your daily tasks were rituals of maintenance, prayers against entropy. You checked the food stores, running your hands over the sack of beans, estimating their volume by touch. You inspected the barrel of flour, noting the level like a scientist tracking a descent. You counted the logs remaining outside, a number's a cold equation against the days ahead. Each action was a tiny assertion of control in a world bent on stripping it away. The world beyond the oiled minus paper window was a still minus life in shades of whitened gray. Snow layered the pines until they bent in silent submission. No animal track broke the smooth expanse, no bird crossed the empty sky. It was a landscape of exquisite, terrible purity, beautiful because it was dead. You looked at it not with wonder, but with a kind of grim recognition. That was the enemy. That silence, that cold, that infinite weight, it was what waited for you if you faltered. Inside, the silence was different. It was textured with small, intimate sounds, the scrape of a spoon in a bowl, the sigh of logs settling in the fire, the rustle of wool as someone shifted position. In that quiet, thoughts became noisy neighbors. You remembered the scent of turned earth in spring, the shocking green of new leaves, the press of a crowd at a market, sensations so vivid they were painful. These memories were not a solace, they were a haunting, proof of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. They underscored the absurdity of your present, this huddled existence in a wooden box at the edge of nothing. Conversation, if it happened, was pared to the essential. Frets were like the last chips of firewood, to be used sparingly and only for clear purpose. Need more wood. Gulls getting low. Winds picking up. Speech became telegraphic, a code for survival. Long silences were not awkward, they were the default state. You learned to communicate in glances, in the sharing of a worn blanket, in the silent offering of the last piece of a hardtack. Relationships distilled under this pressure. All pretense, all triviality, burned away in the cold. What remained was the rough act of shared endurance. You saw the fear in your partner's eyes not as weakness, but as a reflection of your own. A touch on the shoulder, brief and wordless, could say more than an hour of conversation used to. Children absorbed the atmosphere like sponges. Their play grew quiet, internal. They built invisible castles in the dust, conducted silent wars with pinnacle soldiers. I watched the adults with solemn eyes, learning the new grammar of scarcity and stillness. Their laughter, when it came, was a sudden, startling sound, like the crack of ice on a pond, and it would fade quickly, swallowed by the waiting silence. The afternoons were the longest stretch. The chores were done. A light was flattened, fading, and there was nothing left to do but be. This was the true test. The mind, deprived of stimulus, would turn in on itself. It would pick at old scabs of regret, worry at problems with no solution, imagine catastrophes in vivid, unwelcome detail. To combat this, you developed mental disciplines. You would recite every poem or hymn you knew, word by word. You would mentally walk the path to the river, naming each tree and stone. You would study the fire, following a single flame from its birth in the sap to its death in the ash, assigning it a story, a personality. This was not entertainment, it was mental hygiene, a way to keep the wolves like despair from the door. Hunger was a constant, dull companion. It was not the sharp, demanding pain of famine, but a deep, bodily awareness of deficit. Your meals were fuel, calculated and plain. You ate the same cornmeal mush, the same leathery venison, the same softened beans, and you felt your body convert them not into vitality, but into mere heat, a biological fire barely banked. You ceased to think of food as pleasure. It was medicine, a bitter tincture necessary for continued existence. As the short day surrendered, the fire's role transformed. It was no longer just a source of heat, it became the sun and the stars. Its light carved the room out of the darkness, painting the laws and dancing monster shadows. The world beyond its glow ceased to exist. The preparation for night was a sacred, anxious rite. You brought in the logs for the midnight feeding, stacking them within arm's reach of the hearth. You banked the fire with ritual care, covering the glowing hut with ash, a blanket to keep it alive in its sleep. Then you retreated to your bed, a nest of blankets on the floor, and lay listening. And night was alive with sounds the day hid. The cabin groaned as its timbers contracted in the deep cold, sound like footfalls on breaking branches. The wind played a dissonant symphony on the roof, howling in the peaks, whispering under the eaves. In the lounge, the silence was so profound it seemed to vibrate, a note just below hearing. You slept in fits and starts, your body tuned to the fire's dying rhythm. You would surface from dreams of warm thing to the reality of chill, rise on stiff limbs to add a log, and watch the flames resurrect, their light a temporary, beautiful defiance against the dark. Then back to the half-minus sleep, the waiting for dawn. This was the cycle, not of days, but of breaths. Not of living, but of enduring. You were not a pioneer, not a hero. You were a caretaker of a small, fading flame in a vast, frozen cathedral, your entire being focused on one simple, monumental task to keep the spark alive until the world decided to wake up. The concept of the future blurred, then dissolved. Next week was a foreign country. Fixed month was a myth. There was only now, and the now was cold, silent, and identical to the yesterday that preceded it and the tomorrow that would follow. In marked time by erosion, the erosion of the woodpile, the erosion of the food stores, the slow erosion of your own vitality. You grew thinner, quieter, more inward. The face you saw in the dark window glass was a stranger's gaunt, eyes shadowed, marked by an intimacy with hardship. You learned a new kind of patience. Not the gentle patience of waiting for a guest, but the hard, mineral patience of a stone waiting for the glacier to pass. It was a passive, grinding strength. You did not overcome the winter. You absorbed it. You let its silence into you, its cold, its endless white, until you became a part of it, a still point in the stillness. And then, one day, without announcement, a shift. It was not a change you saw, but one you felt in your bones. The air lost its razor's edge. The light through the window held a faint, watery gold, and there was a new sound, the steady, musical drip of melting snow from the roof's edge. Plink, plink, plink. It was the sound of time restarting. It was the fact of the world remembering itself. Nothing else changed, not immediately. The snow was still deep, The cold still gripped the night, but the spell was broken. The infinite white siege had revealed a crack. The waiting was no longer absolute, and had a destination. You found yourself listening for the birds, scanning the gray sky for a wedge of geese. He thought of the seeds stored in a leather pouch, of the ground that would, someday, be soft enough to turn. The future, so long banished, came creeping back timid and full of mud. You emerged not triumphant, but weathered. You had passed through a season of the soul, a long night that had etched its lines upon you, had learned the weight of solitude and the depth of cold. You had discovered that courage is often just the refusal to stop, and that hope in its most durable form is not a feeling, but a stubborn, silent act. The simple, daily tending of a fire. It is the endless dark. Let's step into the space between the words, into the long exhale of a season that would not end. To imagine the air itself turning to glass, brittle and sharp in the lungs. First the silence, a deep, cathedral quiet that fell with the first snow and never lifted. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, a weight pressing on the ears, broken only by the sound of your own being, the crackle of the fire, the rasp of wool on skin, the slow, measured sound of your breath. Time, that reliable river, froze solid here. There was no current, no flow, only a flat, white expanse of identical moments. Morning, the fake lightning at the single window, a smear of gray on oiled paper. No rooster crowed, no neighbor stirred. You woke because the cold finally won, seeping through the layers of blanket and hide, a patient, persistent thief. The act of rising was a battle with gravity and despair. Leave the meager warmth of the bed was an act of faith that the coals still lived, that your stiff limbs would obey, that this day would be survivable. The hearth was an altar of stone and ash. Ing knelt before it, blowing life into the orange embers, your breath of visible prayer. The kindling caught with a weak blue flame, a tiny revolt against the kingdom of cold. You fed its livers, then splinters, then a small log. Warmth, what passed for warmth, began to radiate in a fragile sphere. You could stand with your back to it and feel heat on your calves while your breath still crystallized in the air before your face. This was your world, a small, warm planet adrift in a frozen universe. Your day was a ritual of preservation. You took inventory, not because it changed, but because the ritual itself was a thread of order. You ran your hands over the sack of meal, gauging its fullness by the sag of the cloth. You inspected the last haunch of venison, its surface hard and glossy as stone. You calculated, always calculating. Subtract today's portion from the whole. Divide the woodpile by the days you guessed might remain. The math was never hopeful. It spoke in the conditional tense. If maybe, provided that, the window was a lie. The canister were out, but showed only a monochrome painting, white ground, black trees, gray sky. Sometimes, you scraped the frost from the inside with a fingernail, carving a peephole. The view offered no comfort, only a confirmation of your isolation. You turned away back to the fire, the only thing in the universe that moved. In the quiet, your mind became a noisy room that replayed memories with a cruel clarity, the scent of rain on hot soil, the shocking green of a new leaf, the press of a crowd at a summer fair. These were not comforts. They aren't evidence of a left jazz world. They made the present feel like a punishment, a life sentence served in a small wooden cell. Conversation, when it happened, was stripped to its skeleton. Winds shifted, pots boiling, need more kindling. Language shed its poetry. Words became tools, blunt and deficient. Silence was the more honest language. You spoke it with your partner in the way you passed the last piece of hard bread, in the shared, weary glance at the dying light. Even children learned its grammar. Their play grew still, internal. They built silent cities from wood chips, their imaginations a refuge from the unchanging reality. The afternoons were a desert of time. All tasks were done. Mending, chopping, cleaning, all complete. You were left with nothing but your own company. That's the true frontier, the one inside your skull. To keep the creeping dread at bay, you developed rituals of the mind. You recited every psalm, every rhyme you knew. You mentally walked the path to the crete, naming each rock and root. You studied the fire as if it were a text, reading omens in the collapse of a log, the dance of a spark. This was not idleness. It was the work of staying sane. Hunger was a constant, low hum in the background. Not a sharp pain, but a deep, bodily awareness of absence. You ate the same food, the gritty mush, the tough meat, the bland beans, and you felt it converted not to strength, but to a mere sustaining heat, enough to keep the machine of your body idling. Pleasure had left the table. Eating was maintenance, a refueling for the next shift of waiting. Dusk fell quickly, a lid closing on the day. The fire's role changed. It became the sun, the moon, the only star. Its light carved the room out of the utter blackness, painting monstrous, leering shadows on the walls. The world beyond, its close ceased to exist. Night preparations were a solemn rite. You brought the night's wood inside, stacking it like a barricade beside the hearth. You banked the fire with meticulous care, tucking the coals into a nest of ash, a mother hiding her last ember from the cold. Then you retreated to your pallet and listened. The night was a different country. The cabin spoke in groans and sighs, its timbers contracting in the deep freeze. The wind told long, mournful stories against the roof. In the pauses, the silence was so complete it had a texture, a density. Sleep was thin and fractured. You were a sentry for the fire, waking often to its dimming light, rising to feed it another log. The flare of new flames was a small, beautiful victory in the endless dark. Then you would lie back down, waiting for the next vigil. This was the rhythm, not of life, but of suspended animation. You were not living through winter. You were holding your breath beneath it. Your entire identity, farmer, parent, dreamer, was submerged beneath a single, overwhelming function, survivor. The future vanished. Spring became a fairy tale, a rumor from a distant land. There was only the perpetual frozen now. You changed. You grew quieter, your movements more deliberate. Your face in the dark window a stranger's face, marked by a deep, weary knowledge. You learned a new kind of patience. Not the gentle patience of waiting for a seed to sprout. The hard, flinty patience of the cliff face waiting for the glacier to pass was a strength of stillness, of sheer, dumb persistence. And then, one afternoon, you heard it. A new sound. Blink. A pause. Blink. Blink. Water, not from the pot, but from the roof's edge. A single, melodic drop finding its way through the ice. The sound was absurdly loud in the silence. It was the sound of a clock starting to tick again. The sound of the world remembering it could change. Nothing else was different. The snow was still waist-minus deep. The night was still bitter. That the spell of eternity was broken. The waiting now had a shape, a direction. You found yourself listening for the returning birds, imagining the feel of soft earth under your hands. The future, so long banished, would turn to the sighing, muddy possibility. You did not emerge victorious. You emerged weathered, like a stone smoothed by a relentless sea. You had passed through a season of the soul, a long communion with silence and cold. You had learned that the greatest courage is often invisible, the simple, daily decision to tend the fire, to meet the gray dawn, to outlast the night breath by quiet breath. The winter did not build your character, it revealed it, layer by frozen layer, until all that remained was the stubborn, unspectacular will to see another day. Imagine a world so still, you can hear the snow settling on the branches outside. It is a faint, dry whisper, a sound of weight being added to weight. This is the opening note of a symphony that will last for months, a composition in the key of cold. The air inside the cabin is not merely cool, it possesses a quality of resistance, a thickness that must be parted as you move. Your breath does not vanish, but lingers briefly, a pale, transient ghost in the dim light before the fire. You are not beginning a day. You are resuming a vigil. The darkness of night retreats not to sunlight, but to a pervasive, pearlescent gloom. The window is not a portal, but a milky eye, blind to the world. You rise because the body's need for warmth finally overpowers its desire for oblivion. The journey from bed to hearth is a passage through to climates the desperate. Nest minus like warmth of blankets and the shocking austerity of the open room. The feet learn the cold contours of the floorboards intimately. The fire is not dead but sleeping. A few coals glow beneath their blanket of ash like hearts buried in a cold chest. You coax them with the gentlest twigs, with dried moss, with your own breath held in cupped hands. The first flame is a miracle of yellow in a gray world. It is a decoration. You feed it, piece by precious piece, building a small citadel of heat against the siege outside. The warmth it offers is not generous. It is a tight circle, a personal space you must stand within to feel its benefit. Step outside its radius, and the cold reclaims you instantly. The geography of the cabin is now defined by temperature, not by walls. Here is the warm country by the hearth, and the frozen territories beyond. As you live on a small, mobile island of heat, your tasks are the liturgy of this isolated church. You perform them with a solemn focus. To measure the cornmeal with hands that have grown thin, feeling the granular truth of your remaining days. You inspect the woodpile with the eye of a general assessing dwindling troops. Each log is a soldier against the cold, and their numbers are finite. You walk to the door, open it a crack, and confront the enemy in its pure form. A wall of white, a silence so profound it feels like pressure on the eardrums. The cold that enters is not air, but a solid, shocking presence. You shut the door quickly, leaning against it, grateful for the fragile defense of these log walls. The world has been simplified to its elemental conflicts: heat versus cold, sound versus silence, movement versus stillness. Inside, the silence is of a different kind. It is domestic, woven with the small, intimate sounds of survival. The simmer of the pot, the soft tear of cloth being mended for the 10th time, the rhythmic scratch of a knife being sharpened, more for the occupation it provides than the need. In this quiet, the mind becomes its own landscape, and not always a friendly wing. It drifts backward to impossible summers, two memories so rich with scent and color they feel like cruel jokes. The mind, unethered from the present, begins to fray at the edges. To prevent this, you impose structure. You recite. You remember every verse, every song, every recipe from a life that feels like a story told about someone else. You count. You count the knots in the pine wall, the steps to the water bucket, the number of times the wind gusts in an hour. You observe. You study the way frost creeps across the window pane, building delicate, fern-minus-like cities that bloom and are scraped away, only to bloom again. This is the work of winter, the maintenance of the inner world, the careful husbanding of sanity. Conversation is a luxury that has been rationed. Words, when used, are practical, transcational. They are about the management of shed scarcity. A turn for water. Fire needs a bigger log. Child's cough sounds worse. Beyond this silence is the more eloquent language. A share look across the room can contain a universe of understanding, weariness, worry, a spark of grim humor. May touch on the arm, brief and wordless, says I am here. We are still in this together. The children adapt with the eerie flexibility of the young. The play becomes miniature, silent, conducted in the dust at the hearth's edge. They hold conversations with invisible friends, bad empires from which savings. They watch the adults, absorbing the lesson that this is what the world can become: small, quiet, and very, very cold. The afternoon is the longest stretch of the soul. The necessary chores are complete. The body is idle. Is this when time becomes a tangible weight? You sit, and you wait. You watch the fire consume a log, from vigorous yellow flame to glowing skeleton to soft gray ash. The process takes an hour, and you witness every minute that's passing. You are not bored. Boredom is a privilege of a mind expecting entertainment. You are in a state of pure, unadorned endurance. Hunger is not a sharp pain, but a deep, systemic knowledge. Your body is running on reserves, and it reminds you with a constant, hollow awareness. The meals are fuel, plain and simple. You eat the same coarse bread, the same salted fish, the same pot of beans, and you feel your body converting it not into energy for living, but into the basic heat required for not dying. The concept of flavor belongs to another world. As the fetal weight feels, the fire assumes its nighttime sovereignty. It is no longer just a source of heat. It is the creator of reality. Its light defines the world. Everything outside its flickering orange sphere ceases to exist, swallowed by a blackness so complete it feels like a physical substance. The ritual of bedding down is sacred and anxious. You bring in the night's ammunition, the logs that will be fed to the flames in the dark hours. You bank the fire with the care of a scribe sealing a holy text, covering the heart of the coals with a perfect layer of ash. Then you lie in the near minus dark, wrapped in every scrap of fabric you own, and you listen. The cabin at night is an orchestra of tension. Embers groan as they shrink in the cold. Sounds like distant footsteps or the settling of old bones. The wind, no longer just weather, becomes a character moaning, shrieking, or dropping into a silence so absolute it is more frightening than the noise. Sleep is not rest. It is a shallow pool you dip into, always aware of the cold floor beneath you. You are the guardian of the flame. You wake, not from dreams, but from an ancient instinct, to find the fire guttering. You rise, a spectral figure in your own home at a lawn, and watch as life warm, yellow, beautiful life blooms again in the darkness. The sight is a profound comfort and a profound sorrow. It is beautiful, and it is all there is. This is the cycle, a slow metronome of survival. Tick tend the fire, talk eat the meal, tick watch the snow, talk endure the silence. You are not living a life. You are preserving a spark. Your cast self, with its hopes and plans and petty concerns, felt like a character from a book in read long ago. You are now something simpler, something more fundamental, a being that breathes, tends fire and waits. The future has evaporated. Spring is not a season to anticipate. It is a theological concept, a matter of faith rather than expectation. You exist in a perpetual frozen present, and then one morning, you notice something. Not a sound, but a lack of a sound. The wind has stopped. The relentless pressure against the walls has ceased. The silence is different after, holding a potential. Later you hear it. Drip. A pass long enough to doubt it. Drip. Drip. It is the sound of meltwater. It is the most ordinary sound in the world, and in this context, it is revolutionary. It is the sound of time cracking, of the ice minus lock on the world beginning to slip. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed. The snow is still deep, the nights are still cold, but the unbreakable spell of endless winter is shattered. The waiting is no longer infinite. It has an end, however distant. You find yourself, for the first time in months, thinking in terms of after the thaw, after the mud, after the green returns. You do not feel joy. You feel a deep, weary recognition, like a prisoner hearing the first tap of the chisel on the far side of the wall. You have not conquered the winter. You have matched its patience with your own. You have sat with the silence until you understood its language. You have held the cold so close you learned its contours. You emerge not hardened, but annealed, changed by the long, intimate negotiation with stillness. You carry the memory of that deep cold in your bones, and the memory of that deep quiet in your soul. It becomes a part of you, a season within, a reminder that the world can become very small and very still, and that within that smallness and stillness, the simple act of continuing breath by breath, log by log, day by silent day is its own kind of monument. The cold did not announce itself with a shout, but with a whisper, a gradual leaching of warmth from the world until the very air felt thin and brittle. It was not an event, but a new state of being. You awoke into it, not from sleep, but from a deeper, more profound unconsciousness, as if the world itself had been holding its breath and forgot to exhale. First sensation was not of temperature, but of absence. The absence of birdsong, the absence of wind in the leaves, the absence of the distant, comforting murmur of a creek. In that place, a silence so immense it weep. It crashed against the oiled miner's paper window. It pooled in the corners of the single room. It filled your ears with a high, faint ringing, the sound of your own blood in a world gone mute. Time, that reliable stream, had frozen over. There was no current to carry you forward, only a flat, featureless plain of now. The gray light at the window did not signify dawn, only a slight lessening of the degree of darkness, a shift from black to charcoal. You rose because the body's animal instinct for survival overruled the mind's desire to remain in the false warmth of the blankets. The journey from bed to hearth was a pilgrimage across a tundra of floorboards. Each step was a calculation of loss and gain, the loss of precious stored warmth, the potential gain of a renewed fire. The hearth was a cave of ashes. You probed it with a stick, finding a single stubborn ember glowing like a fallen star in a dead sky. Around it, you built a tiny architecture of hope, a nest of dried moss, a handful of pine needles, the slenderest twigs. You bent close, your breath a visible stream in the cold air, and whispered life back into the world. The flame that answered was timid, a pale, blue-minus, yellow spirit trembling on the edge of existence. You fed it with the devotion of a priest, piece by piece, until it found its voice and crackled with a dry, hungry sound. The heat it gave was not a blanket but a sword that carved a small, defiant space out of the cold, a sphere of influence perhaps 6 feet in diameter. Within that sphere, you could exist. Outside it, winter reigned, absolute and unconcerned. Your daily routine was a liturgy against entropy. You took stock, not because the numbers would change, but because the ritual itself was a thread connecting you to a semblance of order. Your hands, grown familiar with scarcity, measured the cornmeal by weight and feel. Your eyes, accustomed to dimmings, gauged the depth of the woodpile by the shadow it cast. Your mind, honed by anxiety, performed the endless, grim arithmetic of survival, dividing, subtracting, carrying over a remainder of dread. The door was the boundary between worlds. Opening it was an act of reconnaissance. A blast of air, so cold it felt solid, would rush in, brewing with it a scent of pure, frozen nothingness. The view was a study in minimalism: white ground, gray sky, black trees bowed under shawls of snow. No movement, no life. A landscape reduced to its elemental geometry. You closed the door quickly, your heart beating a little faster, as if you had peered over the edge of a great white abyss. Inside, the silence was domestic, but no less profound. It was woven with the small, intimate sounds of perseverance: the soft plop of a bean in the soaking pot, the rhythmic scratch of a knife on whetstone, the sigh of cloth as someone shifted on a stool. This quiet, the mind turned explorer in a treacherous interior landscape. Scenery became a capricious guide, leading you to sun-drenched meadows, to bustling marketplaces, to conversations long finished visions, so vivid they were agonizing. They were not escapes, but accusations highlighting the stark poverty of the present. To prevent madness, you built scaffolds for your thoughts. You recited everything you had ever memorized: psalms, recipes, children's rhymes was paraded through your consciousness, a thin line of words holding back the void. You observed with unnatural intensity. You studied the way the firelight danced on a knot in the wall, how the frost etched its intricate, meaningless maps on the glass, the precise pattern of your partner's breathing as they slept. This was the unrecorded labor of winter, the meticulous, desperate management of your own sanity. The communication distilled into its most potent form. The necessary words evaporated in the dry air. What remained was essential, utilitarian. The north chink needs mud. Water bucket is half. Child is worn, still sleeping. Beyond this, you spoke in a language of gesture and glance. A shared look across the smoky room could convey a day's worth of worry or a spark of weary amusement. Touch, brief and wordless, on a chilled hand was a treaty of solidarity. Children adapted with a silent, solemn wisdom. Their play became miniature, performed in the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. with protagonists made of threatened wood chips. They watched the adults with large, quiet eyes, absorbing the lesson that the world could contract to this a small dim room, and the shared primary task of enduring. The afternoons were an expanse of pure duration. All chores complete, the body fell still. Yes, Valentine's ceased to be linear and became a substance you were immersed in, like thick, cold oil. You did not watch the clock, you felt the day's weight settle upon you. You sat, and you existed. You watched a single log surrender itself to the flames, from solid heft to glowing crimson heart, too delicate, collapsing lace of ash. It was not passing time. It was becoming acquainted with eternity. Hunger was not a pang but a presence, a hollow tenant that had taken up residence in your core, and meals were mere transfers of energy. Devoid of pleasure, you consumed the same coarse porridge, the same leathery strip of dried meat, and felt your body converted not into vitality for living, but into the baseline metabolic warmth required to prevent dying. Taste was a memory. Nourishment was a transaction. As the thin light bled from the sky, the fire has ended to its nightly sovereignty. It was no longer merely a source of heat. It was the author of reality, the creator of the only world that was. Its light defined the boundaries of existence. Beyond its flickering orange frontier lay nothing but a blackness so complete it felt like a solid wall. The ritual of evening was one of faith and fear. You prepared the nights, offering the logs that would be a praxis in the battle against the dark. You banked the fire with meticulous care, tucking the coals into a downy bed of ash, a mother hiding her last child from the wolf at the door, and you lay in the thick darkness, wrapped in the scratchy wool of your own breath, and you listened. The night transformed the cabin into an instrument of tension. The logs protested the cold with groans and sharp cracks, sounds that mimicked intrusion, mimicking fret. The wind was no longer weather, but a voice singing a mournful dirge, shrieking in fury, or falling into a silence so absolute it roared in the ears. And sleep was not a retreat, but a shallow, vigilant state. You were the sentinel of the spark. You would surface from a dreamless doze, summoned by the fire's dimming glow, and rise like a phantom to feed it another log. The eruption of fresh flame, that sudden, glorious bloom of lightened heat, was a small, profound victory in the endless war of the dark. And you would sink back, waiting for the next summons. This was the rhythm. His flow, pray not beat of survival. Thump tend the fire, thump heat the sustenance. Thump watch the unchanging white. Thump hold the silence at bay. You were not living a biography. You were preserving a biological flame. Your former self with its ambitions, its frivolities, its personal history felt like a story about a stranger. You are now something more ancient, more elemental, a keeper of warmth, a witness to stillness. The future dissolved. Spring was not a season on a calendar, it was a myth. A rumor whispered by the wind, an article of faith with no evidence. You inhabited a perpetual, frozen present, a single, drawn minus out note that refused to resolve. And then, one morning, you sensed it before you heard it, a softening in the quality of the air, a faint, almost floral scent beneath the smell of wood smoke and cold. Later the sound, blink, a sound so small, so ordinary, it was revolutionary. A drop of water freed from its icy captivity striking stone. Plink plink minus blink. It was the sound of the lock breaking, the sound of time's glacier beginning its imperceptible, irrevocable grind forward. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The snow still lay deep. The night still bit with toothless gums, for the spell of endlessness was shattered. The waiting was no longer infinite. It had a horizon, however distant. Found yourself for the first time in 100 identical days, thinking in terms of sequence. After the melt, after the mud, after the first green spear breaks the soil, you did not feel triumph. You felt a deep, bone-minus weary recognition, like a prisoner hearing, at last, the faint scrape of a key in a long minus rusted lock. You had not defeated winter. You had sat with it. You had learned its rhythms, its silences, its particular impersonal cruelty. You had matched its infinite patience with your own finite, stubborn will. You emerged not hardened, but annealed, changed at the molecular level by the long, intimate exposure to stillness and scarcity. You carried the memory of that deep cold in the marrow of your bones, and the echo of that profound quiet in the chambers of your heart. It became a season within you, a derivative landscape you could visit in memory, my permanent reminder that the world could narrow to the size of a single room and the scope of a single, monumental task to keep the spark alive, to outlast the dark, to simply continue. Let's begin with the quality of the light. It was a light that had given up, day thin, exhausted gray that seeped through the window, not illuminating, merely distinguishing one shadow from another. It carried no warmth, no promise, was the color of time standing still. You did not greet the morning, you surrendered to it. The cold was your first conscious thought, a sharp, crystalline presence that had infiltrated the blankets, stiffened the wool, settled into the joints. The move was to break a fragile pace, to enter into negotiation with a world that offered no terms. The journey from bed to hearth was a passage through to separate realities, and of residual, trapped warmth, smelling of sleep and wool. The other, the true reality of the room, air so cold it felt like a substance, thickened, resistant. The feet registered each plank, each nothel, with a startling, painful clarity. The hearth was a world of ashes and memory. He sifted through the gray powder with bare, numb fingers, searching for the heartbeat, a single coal, a dull reed ember buried deep. Finding it was a small, profound release. You built a cradle for it, a wisp of tinder, the ghost of last summer's grass, a sliver of bark thin as paper. You bent close, your face to the ashes, and breathed. Not a blow, but a whispered encouragement, a transfer of your own life's warmth. The flame that awoke was blue at its root, trembling, uncertain. You fed it incrementally, with the focused care of a jeweler setting a stone, a wig, another, a small stick. The fire found its voice, a dry, snapping chatter. The heat began to radiate not as a wave, but as a slow, tentative expansion, pushing back the cold an inch at a time. This heat was not a comfort. It was a reprieve. It created a small, temporary oasis in the desert of frost. You stood within its influence, back to the flames, hands outstretched, and felt the heat soak into your palms while your breath still hung in ragged clouds before your face. The warmth did not travel. It existed only where the fire's light fell. The day's work was a study in meticulous conservation. You performed an audit of existence. You weighed the burlap sack of beans in your hands, judging its heft against the memory of yesterday. You counted the remaining candles, not by sight in the dimness, but by touch, of fingers tracing their waxy shoulders. You studied the woodpile through the window, its silhouette shrinking day by day against the endless white. Each calculation was a silent sentence spoken in the mind. If we eat half minus rations, and if the cold moderates, and if no one falls ill, the sentence never had a happy ending. It trailed off into the gray air, unanswered. The door was a barrier to another dimension. To open it was to breach a seal. The cold that entered was shocking in its purity, devoid of any mitigating quality. It was simply absence, the absence of heat, of movement, of life itself. The world outside was a blank page, snow lanes smooth, unbroken drifts, sculpted by a wind that had since moved on. The trees were black skeletons against the white, their branches encased in glassy sheath of ice. It was no sound, not even the memory of sound. It was a vista of perfect, sterile completion. You closed the door quickly, your heart thudding once hard against your ribs. You had looked upon the face of the void, and it was beautiful, and it wanted you gone. Inside, the silence was a different creature. There was a domestic silence, filled with the small, necessary sounds of a life reduced to its basics: the hiss of snow melting in the pot, the creak of a floorboard under a shifting weight, the soft rhythmic scrape of a knife being honed to a useless sharpness. And this contained quiet, the mind, deprived of external input, turned its attention inward, and the interior landscape was not always safe. Memory became a treacherous country that offered visions of impossible abundance, the feel of sun on bare skin, the deafening chorus of crickets on a summer night, the taste of fruit so ripe it burst of its own accord. These were not escapes. They were exquisite tortures, highlighting the barrenness of the present with cruel precision. To dwell on them was to risk a kind of spiritual frostbite. So, you built defenses. You recited. You lined up every piece of poetry, every prayer, every fragment of song you had ever known and marched them through your consciousness like a thin, ragged army holding a pass. You observed with a monk's intensity. You traced the progress of a single water stain on the ceiling. You studied the way your partner's shoulder moved as they stirred the pot, memorizing the geography of weariness. This was the unseen labor, the meticulous, daily repair of your own psyche against the grinding pressure of sameness. Language itself underwent a transformation. Words were too heavy, too costly. They were reserved for transactions of urgent need. Fires choking. More snow for water. The cough lingers. Everything else was communicated in a lexicon of gesture and glance. They said look across the dim room could hold an entire conversation, an acknowledgement of shared fatigue, a flash of grim humor, a wordless question about the children. A hand briefly covering another on the table was a paragraph of solidarity. Silence was the richer dialect. Children metabolized the atmosphere. The boundless energy condensed, turning inward. They held elaborate, soundless councils with cornhusk gulls. They drew intricate maps in the dust with a pointed stick, charting imaginary lands beyond the white walls. They watched the adults with solemn, knowing eyes, learning the primary lesson of this place, that the world could become very small, and that within its confines quiet was a survival skill. The afternoons were the true test. The physical chores were done. The body was idle. Time, which had been passing slowly, now stopped altogether. It became a tangible medium you were suspended in. You sat. You existed. You watched a single log in the fire undergo its complete biography, from solid, stubborn fuel to a raging core of light, to a collapsing architecture of glowing veins, and finally to soft, featureless ash. You did not watch an hour pass. You witnessed a universe being born, living, and dying on your hearth. This was not boredom. It was a form of stark, unmediated contemplation. Hunger was not an event, but an environment. A constant, low-minus great awareness of deficit hummed in the background of your being. The meals were functional, stripped of any pretense of pleasure. You consumed the same thin gruel, the same fibrous, salted meat, and felt your body convert it not into energy for living, but into the mere maintenance heat required to stave off systemic failure. Flavor was a ghost. Nutrition was a mathematical equation. Thus did not fall, it rose. It welled up from the corners of the forest, swallowing the gray light, until only the fire held it at bay. And the fire is no longer just a source of heat. It became the sun, the moon, the creator and definer of all things. Its light painted the room in frantic, dancing shadows, making the familiar strange and slightly threatening. Everything beyond its fiery corona ceased to exist, absorbed into a blackness so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the eyes. The bedtime ritual was an act of faith and profound anxiety. You gathered the night soldiers, the logs that would stand guard while you slept, and stacked them within the circle of firelight. You banked the fire with the precision of a surgeon, layering ash over the coals to smother them just enough to last, but not to die. It was a delicate balance, and getting it wrong meant hours of misery at 3 a.m., and you lay down in the thick darkness, wrapped in every available layer, and you listened. The night was when the cabin spoke its true mind. Freed from the distractions of dim light, you heard its architecture protest the cold. The logs popped with reports like distant gunfire. The roof groaned under the weight of snow. The wind was a capricious spirit, sometimes howling with a voice of ragged grief, sometimes dropping away to a silence so deep it seemed to suck the sound from your own ears. Sleep was not restorative. It was a shallow, vigilant state. You were the guardian of the spark. It would surface from a thin doze, your internal alarm triggered by the fire's fading glow, and rise a spectral figure in your own home to feed it another log. The sight of the flames leaping back to life, that sudden, glorious affirmation of lightened warmth, was a victory so small and so essential it could bring a sting to your eyes. Then you would retreat again, waiting for the next watch. This was the rhythm, the slow, elemental pulse of endurance. Beat sustain the fire, beat ingest the fuel, beat witness the white, beat hold the line against the silence. You were not living a life of narrative. You were performing a biological and psychological maintenance cycle. Your past identity, farmer, parent, dreamer, was in cold storage. You were now a simpler organism, a breather, a fire-minus ender, a vessel of patience. Future evaporated. Spring was not a season to anticipate. It was a theological concept, an article of blind faith in a world that offered no evidence of grace. You lived in a perpetual, frozen present, a single sustained note that refused to resolve into a chord. And then, one afternoon, you felt it before any sense confirmed it. A subtle shift in the pressure of the air. A faint, damp scent rang through the wood smoke, like the memory of earth. Later, the sound, not a crack but a release. Blink, a clear musical note. Water, liberated from its icy bindings, falling free. Blink minus blinked. It was the sound of a clock whose pendulum, frozen in mid-minus swing, had been tapped and had begun, hesitantly, to move again. Nothing was different, and everything was different. The snow still covered the world. The night still brought its bitter chill, but the spell of eternity was broken. The waiting was no longer infinite. It had a destination, however distant. You found yourself, for the first time in a season of identical days, thinking in terms of consequence and sequence. After the thaw, after the mud, after the first fragile green appears, you did not feel joy. You felt a deep, weary recognition, like a prisoner who, after years in a lightless cell, sees the first hairline crack of dawn under the door. You had not conquered the winter. You had sat with it, day after silent day, until you understood its language of stillness. You had matched its vast, impersonal patience with your own small, human stubbornness. You emerged not hardened, but tempered, changed at a fundamental level by the long, intimate exposure to scarcity and silence. You carried the memory of that deep cold in the very structure of your bones, and the echo of that profound quiet in the chambers of your heart. It became a season within you, a dormant landscape you could revisit in memory, a permanent, quiet testament that the world could shrink to the dimensions of a single room and the scope of a single, monumental task to keep the fragile flame of existence burning, to outlast the long white night, to simply, doggedly continue. That's that not with the beginning, but with the middle. That was the true season, the endless, unchanging middle. The world had been reduced to a single, slow note held for months, a hum at the lowest register of existence. This was the time after the first shock of cold had faded, and before any hope of thaw could be imagined. It was the plateau of pure endurance. You woke because your body could no longer sustain the illusion of warmth and sleep. The cold was a patient infiltrator, finding every gap in your woolens, every seam in the blankets. It didn't wake you with a jolt, but with a gradual, inexorable insistence, until the discomfort of lying still outweighed the agony of movement. The room you opened your eyes to was not dark, but profoundly dim. A grainy, textureless light occupied the space, revealing shapes but no details. The window was a slab of frosted milk. The act of rising was a series of small, painful negotiations. First, the abandonment of the nest minus, like hollow of warmth your body had carved in the bedding. Then the exposure of skin to air so cold it felt like a mild burn. Finally, the solid, shocking chill of the floorboards under your bare feet, a sensation so sharp it was almost a taste, metallic and clean. The hearth was the center of all meaning. You approached it not as a piece of furniture, but as a living entity in a coma. The ashes were cool to the touch. You sifted through them with careful fingers, a prospector panning for a single grain of gold. And there it was, one coal, a dull, red-eye staring sight lustily from its bed of gray. This was the day's first and most important act of faith. You built a tiny pyre over it, a curl of birch bark, a tuft of dry grass from the summer before, a handful of pine needles brittle as old bones. You bent so close your nose almost touched the ash, and you exhaled a long, steady stream of your own warmth, a direct transfusion of life. For a moment nothing, then a wisp of smoke, thin as a thought. A faint orange glow winked deep within the timber. A tiny flame, blue at its base, flickered into being, trembling like a newborn thing. Feeling this evoked was not happiness, but a profound, quiet relief. The world had not ended in the night. As you fed the flame with infinite care, a sliver of wood no thicker than a pencil, then another, the fire gained confidence, its voice changing from a whisper to a soft crackle. Heat began to emanate not as a wave, but as a slow, radiant blooming. It did not warm the room. It created a small temporary zone where warmth was possible. You stood within this zone, turning slowly like a roasting bird, letting the heat soak into your front while your back prick led with cold. This was your universe, a 6-foot sphere of conditional survival. The day's labor was a ritual of accounting and conservation. You took inventory with your senses, not with lists. You hefted the sack of cornmeal, judging its weight against the memory of yesterday's heft. You ran a hand along the row of hanging dried apples, counting their leathery forms by touch in the gloom. You peered at the woodpile through the window, its outline a jagged silhouette against the blinding white, and estimated the number of days it represented. Each calculation was a silent sentence that began with and ended with a question mark. If we brownie by night, if we stretch the beans with more snow minus water, if the best stay quiet and doesn't need extra warmth. The sentences hung in the cold air, unfinished, their answers lost in the vast, white silence outside. The door was the boundary between the human world and the elemental one. Opening it was a necessary blasphemy. The cold that rushed in was shocking in its purity. It had no scent, no moisture, no character except absolute frigidity. It was simply the absence of heat, and it asserted that absence with violent authority. The view was a study in negation. The snow had erased the path, the fence, the shape of the land itself. The trees were black scribbles against a field of white, their branches sheathed in ice that glittered dully under the gray sky. There was no movement, no sound. It was a world finished, complete in its sterile perfection. You closed the door quickly, your lungs seizing from the assault. You had glimpsed the true state of things, and it was beautiful, and it was utterly indifferent to your trembling form. Inside, the silence regained its domestic texture, was woven now with the small, intimate sounds of a life pared down to its necessities, the plop of a dried pea into the soaking pot, the rhythmic scratch minus scratch of a knife on a whetstone, the soft sigh of wool as someone shifted on a stool. In this contained quiet, your mind, starved for novelty, turned its gaze inward, and the interior vista was often a treacherous one. Memory became a cinema of cruel nostalgia. It projected visions in impossible technicolor, the sweat minus damp feel of a shirt on a July afternoon, the deafening, green chorus of spring peepers, the overwhelming sweetness of a wild strawberry bursting on the tongue. These were not comforts. They were exquisite forms of torture, highlighting the sensory poverty of the present with unbearable clarity. To linger on them was dangerous. So you built mental barricades. You recited. You assembled every scrap of verse, every hymn, every childhood rhyme, every bit of gossip or family lore, and you marched them through your consciousness in a ragged, endless parade. You observed with the intensity of a scientist studying a new species. You chased the intricate fractal patterns of froth on the windowpane. You studied the way the firelight played across the grain of a particular floorboard, watching the shadows shift with each dying lot. This was the unseen, unheralded work of winter, the daily, meticulous repair of your own sanity against the erosive pressure of sameness. Language underwent a process of distillation. Superfluous words evaporated. What remained was a stark, utilitarian code. Fire needs pine. Water bucket size. Child's forehead is cool. Everything else of importance was communicated in a silent language of gesture and glance. They had shared across the smoky room could contain an encyclopedia of shared understanding, fatigue, worry, a flicker of grim amusement. A hand briefly placed on the shoulder was a novel's worth of solidarity. Silence became the more profound dialect. Children adapted with a silent, eerie wisdom. Their vibrant energy turned inward, becoming potential rather than motion. I conducted elaborate, soundless dramas with acorn-minus cat people. They drew intricate, vanishing cities in the hearth sashes with a stick. They watched the adults with large, solemn eyes, absorbing the lesson that this was the world's default setting, small, quiet, and requiring immense reserves of patience. The afternoons were the true crucible. With all necessary chores complete, the body fell still. Time, which had been passing like a sluggish river, now ceased to flow entirely. It became a lake of frozen moments. You sat. You inhabited your own presence. You watched a single log in the fireplace and act its entire destiny, from a solid, dense mass of potential energy to a roaring nucleus of lightened heat, to a fragile, glowing lattice of embers, and finally to a soft mound of gray ash. You did not witness an outpassing. You witnessed a complete life cycle, a microcosm of existence itself, burning brightly and then vanishing on your hearth sign. This was not idleness. It was a form of stark, unmediated meditation. Hunger was not a sensation, but a condition, a constant, low-minus-grade awareness of deficit hummed in the background of your consciousness, like the drone of a distant waterfall. The meals were transactions, not experiences. You consumed the same thin porridge, the same tough, salted fish, and felt your body converted, not into vitality for living, but into the baseline metabolic fuel required to prevent systemic collapse. Flavor was a ghost from another life. Nourishment was a cold equation. Dusk did not arrive, it accumulated. It seeped from the corners of the forest, thickening the gray air until the room became a cave. Then the fire underwent its apotheosis. It was no longer merely a source of heat. It became the sun and the stars. It was the author of reality. Its dancing, inch light defined the world. Every ewe beyond its reach was swallowed by a blackness so complete it felt like a solid wall. The evening ritual was an act of faith tinged with deep anxiety. You gathered the night's defenders, the logs that would stand watch in the darkness, and stacked them within the sacred circle of firelight. You banked the fire with the precision of an archivist sealing a precious document, layering fine ash over the heart of the coals to preserve their life through the long, frozen hours. It was a gamble every night. Too much ash, and the fire would suffocate. Too little, and it would burn too fast, leaving you in the cold well before dawn. Then you lay down in the profound dark, wrapped in a cocoon of coarse wool, and you listened. The night was when the cabin revealed its soul, freed from the diffusing effect of daylight. Every sound was magnified. Timbers contracted with sharp cracks like breaking bones. The roof beams ground under the weight of snow. The wind was a capricious deity, sometimes screaming in fury against the eaves, sometimes falling into a silence so deep it seemed to vacuum the sound from your very ears. Sleep was not restful. It was a shallow, vigilant state. You were the guardian of the spark. You would surface from a thin, dreamless doze, summoned by the fire's dimming glow, and rise like a phantom to feed it another log. The sight of the flames leaping back to life, that sudden, glorious eruption of lightened warmth in the absolute black, was a victory so small and so essential it could tighten your throat. Then you would sink back into the chill, waiting for the next summons. This was the rhythm, the slow, primal drumbeat of survival. Thud sustain the flame, thud ingest the fuel, thud contemplate the white, thud hold the silence at bay. You were not living a life of story. You were performing the maintenance cycle of a complex organism in a hostile environment. Your previous identity, with its dreams, its social roles, its personal history, felt like a biography of someone you had once met. You were now something more ancient, a keeper of the flame, a witness to the long dark. The future dissolved into mist. Spring was not a season to be anticipated, it was a myth. A rumor passed between the winds, an article of blind faith in a universe that offered no evidence of cyclical mercy. You lived in a perpetual frozen present, a single sustained note that refused to resolve into a chord of change. And then, one morning, you sensed it before any of your five senses could confirm it. A subtle softening in the quality of the air. They faint, but sent beneath the dominant notes of wood smoke and cold stone, like the memory of soya. Later, the sound. Not a crack of ice, but a release. Plink. A single, clear, musical note. Water, having won its long struggle against solidity, falling free. Plink, 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 minus plink, minus plink. It was the fat of a great froth and crack being wound, the sound of time remembering its forward motion. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The snow still lay in deep, unbroken drifts. The night still bit with a toothless, persistent cold, but the spell of endlessness was broken. The waiting was no longer infinite. It had a horizon, however distant. You found yourself, for the first time in a season of identical days, thinking in terms of sequence and consequence. After the melt, after the mud, after the first impossible spear of green stabbing through the brown earth, you did not feel elation. You felt a deep, weary recognition, like a prisoner who, after years in a lightless cell, sees the first hairline crack of dawn under the door and knows, with a certainty beyond joy, that the long night is finally ending. Had not conquered the winter. You had sat with it, day after silent day, until you understood its language of stillness and scarcity. You had matched its vast, impersonal patience with your own small, stubborn, human will to persist. You emerged not hardened, but annealed, changed at the crystalline level by the long, intimate exposure to absolute quiet and elemental cold. You carried the memory of that deep chill in the marrow of your bones, and the echo of that profound silence in the chambers of your heart. It became a season within you, a durant landscape you could revisit in memory. Wide, permanent testament that the world could shrink to the dimensions of a single room, into the scope of a single, monumental, unheroic task to keep the fragile flame of existence burning, to outlast the long white night, to simply, doggedly, and without fanfare continue. Let's begin with the silence. It arrived before the snow, a gradual subtraction of sound. The chatter of squirrels ceased. The distant complaint of wagon wheels on the road faded, then vanished. The wind, when it came, did not howl but sighed, a long exhalation that seemed to empty the world of noise. Soon, the only sound was the sound of your own body, the rush of blood in your ears, the dry click of a swallow, a soft, rhythmic saw of your own breath. This was not peace. It was the quiet of a held breath, the pause before a decision that never came. The light followed suit, abandoning all ambition. It was a gray, directionless glow that seeped into the cabin, revealing nothing, illuminating nothing. It was the color of forgetting, that lay upon surfaces without warmth or shadow, erasing depth, making the world appear to minus-dimensional. The window was not a portal but a pale, blind eye. You woke not to a new day, but to the same one, endlessly recurring. The cold was your blanket, your companion, your first conscious thought. It had woven itself into the fabric of the night, into the wool of your socks, into the very air you drew into your lungs. The move was to break a fragile truce. You lay still, measuring the dwindling warmth of your own body against the encroaching chill, until the calculation tipped and forced you to rise. The floor was a shock of pure sensation. The cold shot up through the soles of your feet, a sharp, clear message from the frozen earth below. You moved to the hearth with the stiff, careful gait of someone crossing a frozen river, testing for weakness with each step. The fireplace with a mouth full of ashes. You knelt before it, not in prayer, but in supplication. Your fingers, clumsy with cold, sifted the gray powder, and there a single stubborn ember, a red pupil in a dead gray eye. Hope was not an emotion here, it was a physical object, small enough to fit on a fingertip, fragile enough to be extinguished by a breath. You built a nest for it, a scrap of cloth, a twist of dry grass from a summer you could barely remember, a sliver of birch bark that curled like a sleeping insect. You cupped your hands around this tiny universe and breathed. Your breath fogged, then vanished. You breathed again, a steady, focused stream of your own moist heat. For a long moment, nothing. Then, a wisp of smoke, thin as a ghost, ape in point of orange glowed in the heart of the tender flame. Blue and trembling was born. The feeling was not triumph. It was relief so profound it bordered on sorrow. The world had not ended in the night. You had been granted another reprieve. You fed it. Not with logs, but with promises. A twig, a sliver, a stick no thicker than your finger. The fire grew, its voice changing from a whisper to a soft, confident crackle. Heat began to radiate not as a wave but as a slow, patient assertion of a different reality. It did not warm the room. It created a small, temporary pocket where warmth was possible. You stood within this pocket, turning slowly, presenting first your front and your back to the flames. This was your kingdom, a sphere of air 6 feet across, bounded by an invisible wall of cold. The day's work was a ritual of preservation, a battle against entropy. You took inventory not with pen and paper, but with touch and intuition. You ran your palms over the sack of beans, feeling the shift of granules, estimating the slope of depletion. You stayed the shadow cast by the woodpile against the white wall of snow outside, measuring its dictate. You listened to the wind, not for its song, but for its direction. A north wind meant deeper cold. A shift to the east might mean nothing, or everything. Every observation fed a silent, endless calculation in your mind. If we eat 1 cup of meal instead of 2 today, and if the baby stays quiet and doesn't burn extra calories crying, and if the cold breaks before the new moon, the equations never balanced. They always ended in a question mark, a silent plea sent into the gray air. The door was the boundary between the human and the elemental. To open it was to commit unnecessary violence. The cold that entered was shocking in its purity. It had no scent, no moisture, no personality. It was simply absence, the absence of heat, of life, of mercy. The world it revealed was a study in erasure. Snow had smoothed the land into a featureless plain. Trees stood as black, tortured sculptures, their branches encased in ice that glittered with a dull, internal light. There was no movement, no track, no sign that anything had ever lived here. It was a world finished, complete in its sterile perfection. You closed the door quickly, your lungs aching from the assault. You had glimpsed the truth, and the truth was beautiful, and it wanted nothing to do with you. Inside, the silence resumed, but it was a domestic silence now, textured with the small, intimate sounds of a life reduced to its essentials: the hiss of snow melting in the black pot, the rhythmic scrape of a knife on stone, the soft thump of a kneading fist on bread dough. In this contained quiet, your mind, starved for stimulus, turned inward, and the interior landscape was often a barren one. Memory became a cinema of exquisite cruelty that projected visions and impossible detail: the sleek, sweaty feel of a hoe handle in August, the deafening green roar of a frog pond at dusk, the shocking, tight burst of a wild gooseberry on the tongue. These were not comforts. They were instruments of torture, highlighting the sensory poverty of the peasant with unbearable clarity. To dwell on them was to risk a kind of madness. So, you built mental fortifications. You recited, you assembled every fragment of verse, every hymn, every childhood chant, every bit of family lore, and marched them through your consciousness in a ragged, endless parade. You observed with the ferocious attention of a naturalist discovering a new world. You studied the way the frost etched its delicate, crystalline cities on the windowpane, only to have them obliterated by your breath. You traced the grain in a single floorboard, following its rivers and valleys until you knew it better than the lines on your own palm. This was the unrecorded labor, the daily, meticulous repair of your own sanity against the grinding pressure of sameness. Language underwent a process of ruthless efficiency. Superfluous words were burned for fuel. What remained was a stark, utilitarian code. Fire needs the oak. Water barrel skinned with ice. The coffin her chest is looser. Everything else of importance was communicated in a silent language of gesture and glance. The look exchanged across the smoky room could contain a volume of shared understanding, an acknowledgement of shared fatigue, a spark of grim humor, a question about the supplies. A hand briefly covering another on the table, as an entire treatise on solidarity. Silence became the richer, more nuanced tone. Children adapted with a quiet, eerie wisdom. Their vibrant energy turned inward, becoming potential rather than motion. They conducted elaborate, sadness epics with Pinacone armies. They drew intricate, vanishing maps in the ashes of the hearth. They watched the adults with large, solemn eyes, absorbing the fundamental lesson that the world could become very small, and that within its confines, stillness was the first survival skill. The afternoons were the true crucible. With all necessary chores complete, the body fell still. Time, which had been passing like silt through still water, now ceased to move at all. It became a substance you were suspended in. Thick and cold, you sat. You inhabited your own presence. June watched a single lawn surrender itself to the flames, enacting its entire biography from a dense, stubborn mass of potential to a roaring out of light, to a fragile, glowing skeleton, and finally to a soft mound of anonymous gray ash. You did not witness an hour passing. He witnessed a complete cosmology, creation, glory, decay, and dust played out on the stone stage of your heart. This was not idleness. It was a form of stark, unavoidable contemplation. Hunger was not a sensation, but a climate, ray constant, low minus pressure system of need hummed in the background of your being. The meals were transactions, not experiences. You consumed the same thin gruel, the same fibrous, salt minus cured meat, and felt your body convert it not into energy for living, but into the basic fuel required to prevent systemic collapse. Flavor was a memory from a lost country. Nourishment was a cold, hard fact. Dusk did not fall, it rose. It welled up from the floor of the forest, a tide of darkness that swallowed the gray light until only the fire held it at bay. Then the fire underwent its transformation. It was no longer merely a source of heat. It became the sun and the stars. It was the author of all reality. That sleeping brings light to find the world. Everything beyond its flickering frontier was consumed by a blackness so complete it felt like a physical wall. The evening ritual was an act of faith edged with deep anxiety. You gathered the night sentinels, the logs that would stand guard in the abyss, and stacked them within the sacred circle of firelight. You banked the fire with the precision of an archivist sealing a priceless manuscript, layering fine ash over the front of the coals to preserve their life through the long, frozen vigil. It was a gamble taken every night. Too much ash, and the fire would smother little, and it would blaze too fast, abandoning you to the cold long before dawn. Then you lay down in the profound dark, wrapped in a cocoon of rough wool, and you listened. The night was when the cabin spoke its secret language. Freed from the diffusing effect of dim light, every sound was amplified to a significance. Timbers contracted with sharp, percussive cracks. The roof groaned under the immense weight of silence and snow. The wind was a capricious spirit, sometimes screaming in fury at the walls, sometimes falling into a silence so absolute it seemed to pull the sound from your very soul. Sleep was not rest. It was a shallow, vigilant state. You were the guardian as the spark. You would surface from a thin, dreamless doze, summoned by the fire's dying light, and rise like a phantom to feed it another log. The sight of the flames leaping back to life, that sudden, glorious defiance of the absolute dark, was a victory so small and so essential it could tighten your throat with an emotion too complex to name. And you would sink back into the chill, waiting for the next thumbing. This was the rhythm, a slow, primal drumbeat of survival. Thumped and the flame, thump ingest the fuel, thump contemplate the white void, thumb hold the line against the encroaching silence. You were not living a life of narrative. You were performing the essential maintenance cycle of an organism in a state of protracted siege. Your former identity, with its dreams, its social roles, its personal history, felt like a story about someone you had once known. You were now something more ancient and elemental, a keeper of the flame, a witness to the long dark. The future dissolved into mist. Spring was not a season to be anticipated, it was a rumor, a myth whispered by the wind, an article of blind faith in a universe that showed no evidence of ever changing its mind. It lived in a perpetual, frozen present, a single, sustained note that refused to resolve into a new chord. And then, one morning, you sensed it before any of your five senses could confirm it. Subtle softening, and the pressure of the air on your skin. A faint, green scent beneath the dominant notes of wood smoke and cold wall, like the memory of crashed mouth. Later, the sound. Not the crack of splitting ice, but the sound of release. Clink, a single, clear, musical note. Water, having won its long silent war against solidity, falling free. Plink, 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 minus, plink, minus, plink. It was the sound of a great, frozen clock being wound. The sound of time remembering its purpose. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The snow still lay in deep, unbroken drifts. The night still pressed its cold mouth against the window. But the spell of endlessness was broken. The waiting was no longer infinite. It had a horizon, however distant. You found yourself, for the first time in a season of identical days, thinking in terms of sequence and consequence. After the melt, after the mud, after the first impossible, spear mine a step of green piercing the monochrome world. You did not feel elation. You felt a deep, weary recognition, like a prisoner who, after years in a lightless cell, sees the first hairline crack of dawn under the door and knows, with a certainty beyond joy, that the long night is finally ending. You had not conquered the winter. You had sat with it, day after silent day, until you understood its grammar of stillness and its poetry of scarcity. You had matched its vast, impersonal patience with your own small, stubborn, human will to see another dawn. You emerged not hardened, but annealed, changed at the molecular level by the long, intimate exposure to absolute quiet and elemental cold. You carried the memory of that deep chill in the marrow of your bones, and the echo of that profound silence in the chambers of your heart. It became a season within you, a dormant landscape you could revisit in memory, a quiet, permanent testament that the world could shrink to the dimensions of a single room in the scope of a single monumental, unheroic task to keep the fragile flame of existence burning, to outlast the long white night, to simply, doggedly, and without fanfare continue.